This oral history interview of Robert H. Miller, former Speaker of the Kansas House of Representatives, is being conducted under the sponsorship of the Kansas Oral History Project, Incorporated, a nonprofit corporation created for the purpose of establishing an archive of oral histories of Kansas state legislators who served prior to the year 2000. These interviews are funded in part by a grant from the Kansas Humanities Council. Professor Ed Flingy of Wichita State University is conducting the interview at the Kansas State House in Topeka on November 9, 2017. Audio and visual services are provided by the Chapman Center for Rural Studies at Kansas State University under the direction of Tom Parrish. Mr. Miller farms in Sumner County, Kansas. He graduated from Kansas State University in 1967. He was first elected to the Kansas House of Representatives in 1970 at the age of 26 and re-elected to 12 additional terms, serving from 1971 through 1997. He served as Majority Leader of the House in the 1989 and 90 legislative sessions, as Minority Leader in the 1991 and 92 legislative sessions, and as Speaker in the 1993 and 94 legislative sessions. So does that sound reasonably accurate?
To the best of my knowledge, that's pretty accurate.
Good. Well, Bob, we've known each other for quite a while.
That's right. I believe we met during the Avery docking campaign.
And you were active in Young Republicans, or college
That's right.
Republicans at the time. Were you born with kind of a political gene, or where'd this come from?
It came from my time at Kansas State. I've told the story numerous times to Rotary banquets and other such groups that was always tight with the dollar, because growing up on the farm, I didn't have a lot of extra spending money. So when I went to Kansas State, the first or second week of school, they had an activities fair, and the cheapest organization that I could join was, for $1 you could be a member of the College Republicans, and I got my dollar's worth. I didn't miss a meeting. I went to all the activities and very quickly fell in love with it.
So literally started at the university.
That's right.
Not before.
Not before. My family was very, and I didn't know really when I was in college, how my folks were registered.
So obviously you graduated in 67, ran in 70, so had you been thinking about that?
No.
What prompted you to kind of sign up? And
probably for all the wrong reasons. When I graduated, I spent time in the Air Force, and I came back and I wanted to continue my involvement in politics. And one of the things that we'd done at K-State was there were closing hours at the dorms for the girls' dorms. So the guys on weekends, after they had to take the girls back, we'd meet out at the Holiday Inn for coffee and talk politics and talk strategy and what we're going to do in student government, what we're going to do the next time around. I wanted to get involved in those kinds of discussions in Sumner County and Wellington, and I kept inquiring, and finally another farmer who was the head of the County Taxpayers Association, or really it was the Anti-Taxpayers Association, said, if you're so dang interested, why don't you run for office? So I thought, okay, we had a guy that had been in office he was running for his 10th year, his 5th term. I'll run, I'll lose, but that'll show him that I'm interested, and I'll they'll start drinking coffee with me. Well, I won. And then I found out the reason I didn't get invited was because nobody was drinking coffee. They would get together for a county Republican meeting every 2 years when the law said they had to have a meeting, and that was it.
Did you campaign to, I'm going to go to Topeka and change something, or was it?
I campaigned,
Do that.
The fellow I beat went by the name of Whitey. His name was Elmer Holt, but everybody knew him as Whitey. And he was exactly 50 years older than I was. And I knew I really couldn't campaign against him because the demographic of the district was a lot more in his favor than it was in my favor. So I campaigned on, that I wanted to help make Sumner County a better place to live, to work, and raise a family. Just a positive campaign. And at that point in time, Richard Nixon was kind of riding up a wave of popularity. It might not have lasted long, but I tried to attach myself. It wasn't a presidential election year, but I tried to attach myself somewhat to some of the things he was doing.
You get to the State House, and in the time period before you seek leadership, you start as a backbencher, and were there committees that attracted your interest in terms of public policy?
Well, my first term, when it filled out of my memory, when I filled out a questionnaire, I pretty well said, I want to be on the Ag and Livestock Committee, and wherever else you think I will fit in. I got put on local government and oil and gas, and I think oil and gas maybe met 2 times during the 2-year session, and then the committee went away. But by my second term, I knew what I wanted to be on, and I asked to be on the Federal and State Affairs Committee, and got that assignment. And by then, I'd started getting a real feel for a love of the policy, and not the politics, which is what brought me to run for office, but the policy.
What was it about federal and state affairs?
It was just the whole variety of issues that it dealt with. I didn't really like the local government committee because I didn't have an experience in local government, and debating township laws or cemetery district laws seemed to me pretty boring. Some of the other committees, like education, although probably one of the most important committees, without a background on a school board or in education. At that time, I was single the first 12 years I served in the legislature, so I didn't really even have a background in education as far as having children in the school system. And Federal and State Affairs just had the whole variety of, we were doing a lot of things in corrections at that time, and it was just pretty fascinating.
Were there any issues on federal and state affairs that you pursued, again, before leadership? Don't you recall?
Later on, I became, I went off of the committee for a while, and then I went back on as chairman. And that's where I really probably got my teeth in issues, not because they were parades that I, wanted to get out in front of, but it just came with the territory. The constitutional amendments on pari-mutuel, liquor by the drink, and the state lottery all came through the committee. Then the following year, since they all passed, the voters approved all 3 of those, the implementing legislation came through. There was local interest or local expertise in the liquor issues. There was local interest and some expertise in pari-mutuel, both from the horse racing side and the dog racing side. But since Kansas never had a lottery, there weren't any Kansas companies that were involved in the lottery, there wasn't any local expertise. So it was kind of a natural that I became, at least in my eyes, the expert on that.
When you say local, how are you meaning that?
People in Kansas. Anybody that was coming in to put something together on a state lottery was coming in from the outside, the various vendors and law enforcement people and so on.
I noticed you were on Ways and Means and then went off. Was that not something that
Well,
particularly?
the logistics of that were kind of interesting. My first major committee chairmanship was one I really wanted and I really enjoyed, and that was energy and natural resources. And this was during the Carter administration and the energy crisis. And I really enjoyed that and worked with Governor Carlin very closely on getting a number of things passed. Some of it were his ideas, some were my ideas, a lot of them were other people's ideas. But it was just a lot of fun. But I wore out my welcome in certain elements of the Republican Party because of taking too much of a pro-consumer point of view and viewed as anti-utility. That coupled with my policy on not letting lobbyists take me out and buy me a drink, buy me coffee. I'd wanted so hard to have coffee with the big boys, and then I wouldn't let them buy me the coffee, but that's probably an oxymoron right there. But anyway, between my positions on the lobbyist and my positions on some of the energy issues, I'd kind of worn out my welcome, and I think I was pretty good at reading the handwriting on the wall that I probably wasn't going to be that chairman. So I went to the incoming speaker and said, I'll save you the energy of kicking me off the committee. Why don't you put me on appropriations? I'd love to be the vice chairman of the appropriations committee. We kind of had a deal, and then something happened, and I wasn't made the vice chairman, but it's kind of an insider's game on the Ways and Means Committee. But the front five, 3 Republicans and two Democrats, kind of are on the subcommittee that make all the big decisions. Yeah. So I was the 3rd Republican on that, and I was having a good time. And then after 1 year of that, Neil Whitaker, who was a good friend of mine in the legislature and personally, was the chairman of the Federal and State Affairs Committee. He resigned to take a job as a lobbyist. And, I don't see a real future for me in leadership positions in the short term on Ways and Means. So I called the speaker and said, could I get moved over? Well, they gave him another opening on the front five, and he jumped at that, and kind of the rest is history.
Yeah. I noticed you were on post audit and
Yes.
chaired post audit
Yes.
a number of years.
Yes.
Anything you remember of that assignment?
Well, up until that point in time, the post audit was created when the constitutional amendment did away with the position of state auditor, and when the post audit committee, it was a joint committee of post audit, and the chairmanship alternated between the House and the Senate, and it was the chairman of the Senate Ways and Means and the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Well, the speaker split that off. That was another little crumb, but an important crumb that he gave me. And when I left appropriations, I never knew if he forgot, but I got to do that for a number of years, and part of that time I was also chairman of the Rules Committee, so I was really wearing 3 hats at a time. And I always thought somebody wasn't looking at the list very carefully, but I didn't say anything. But we did a number of audits. Some of them were kind of fun. Using to see if the Kansan phone system was being abused by state employees, and we found out that people from the governor's office had been calling out-of-state radio stations to request songs to be played for their boyfriends. And but there were other audits on the misuse of dealers' license tags that led to some changes in laws.
Before you're aspiring to leadership, what would you point to? And that was, you were 71 through, 15 or more years. And it's unfair for ask you to look back 30 years. And are there any 1, 2, 3 things you would point to that I made a difference in this, in those early years?
There were a number of energy issues that we passed. They've been undone since then, so I really didn't make a difference. Probably the things, and I've told people that this will never, nobody will ever put this in my obituary or on my tombstone, but probably the things that I hung in for on the enabling legislation on liquor by the drink and pari-mutuel and to a little bit lesser degree the lottery.
And those were through federal and state?
Those were through federal and state affairs, which is where and that's the chairmanship I had when I then ran for majority leader.
Now, those in particular were, I kind of think of them as gubernatorial initiatives, and you were, in a sense, I'm thinking of Carlin,
Right.
kind of representing a Republican point of view on those.
Well, there really wasn't on those issues. It wasn't very partisan.
Yeah.
That's my memory of it. It wasn't very partisan.
Do you remember leaving your imprint on anything in particular on, say, the liquor by the drink, or I remember local option, for example, local vote to go into the liquor by the drink.
Right. Well, the amendment itself had that provision that any county that and this is my memory's probably going to get off a little bit here, but any county that passed the constitutional amendment, liquor by the drink would be legal in that county. Any county that didn't would have to have another vote in subsequent times. And there's also provisions in there for only a certain amount of the revenue had to come from food in order to have the drinking license. Probably the thing where Ed Riley was the chairman of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, and him and I probably had completely different personalities, especially in dealing with these issues. But his thought was just convert the existing private liquor laws into drinking establishments and then move on for the rest of the battles at a different day. And the governor and I thought, let's use this momentum, this opportunity to move us even farther forward. So we included and successfully included in that legislation things that everybody takes for granted now, such as when you go into a hotel, you can have a mini bar in your room. What did that have to do with liquor by the drink? But it is in the very base, that is liquor by the drink, yeah. But it didn't, wouldn't have been done if we hadn't, dug in. Modernizing the laws on what retail liquor stores. Up until that time, a retail liquor store had to have an exit, in the entrance to the liquor store had to be out onto the street. So if you went into a mall and there was a liquor store at the mall, you had to go back outside and come in. That was for law enforcement purposes originally. Yeah. A hotel, you'd have to go outside, come back in to buy a bottle to take to your room. There were literally 20 or 30 things like that.
And during all of this, no lunches with the lobbyists?
That they paid for, that's right.
They paid for, okay. Well, let's jump to after the '88 election, 67 Republicans in the House. You jump into a leadership race. How do you remember
that one's pretty. My memory is pretty clear, and since one of my the opponents in that race is standing in the room, it better be pretty accurate too. I'd never aspired to leadership, primarily, and I've mentioned this a couple times already because of my image as Mr. Clean, which isn't how I viewed myself. But I didn't think that I would ever could get elected. I didn't really have political aspirations beyond the legislature. So election night, general election night, I'm having a small party out out at the farm, and in Sumner County, and there was a race going on between the incumbent majority leader Joe Knopp of Manhattan and a state representative from Salina, Bob Ott, and I don't remember what sequence these phone calls came in, but I got phone calls saying they'd both been defeated. So all of a sudden, here's an opening for a leadership position. The leadership election is in 3 weeks. I quickly decided that maybe the people don't like me, can't get organized because they're not going to be in Topeka at the same time between that period of time. So, I started mobilizing, support, and obviously some other people had, for different reasons, had exactly the same set of thoughts, and it became a three-way majority leaders race. Which,
how did you mobilize support?
Lots of phone calls, and then road trips to meet the new people that had been elected, and road trips to see a few of the people that I'd served with and hadn't gotten particularly close to.
What was your pitch?
That I had good relations with the press, that I could be a good organizer, and I pointed to my successes with the issues in federal and state affairs, but primarily that hey, give me a chance. I'm a good guy.
I've served time, and I'm willing to take it on. Burdett Loomis did a book on the '89 session, and I kind of prepped for this interview by going back, and Robert Miller's in that book in a number of places. He has a couple descriptions of Robert Miller, an independent, reform-oriented legislator, in quotes, aloof and distant, in quotes. Are those fair?
I think they're fair. Maybe not for the reasons that people would ascribe to those words. I think people thought the fact that I wouldn't let a lobbyist buy me a cup of coffee, or take me to dinner, I was being aloof and distant. And I'm not a warm, cuddly guy. I mean, even today at 73 years old, when somebody comes up and gives me a hug, I can't. And what's this for? So the words fit but not for quite the context that a lot of people saw them in.
Loomis did an interview of you at the time, and in a sense asking the same question I'm asking, and your response, reported by him at least, was, "I want a role in agenda setting." You remember? Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Was there something you wanted on the agenda?
No, I've again, in a lot of the talks I've given over the years about being in the legislature, one of the things the reason I love being in politics when I discovered it in college, I didn't want to be one of the people that sat around, reacting to what was on TV, what Johnny Carson at that time had been saying on the Tonight Show. I wanted to be there when the decisions were being made, not only how to do things, but what we were going to do things about. So it set in the agenda.
Is there any, that race, according to Loomis again, was 3 ballots, and I think you won in December of '88 by 1
Right.
vote. How would you describe your group?
In my group of supporters?
Yeah, the 34 who finally said, we want Bob Miller.
It was mixed. The divisions then, they weren't really divisions. A lot of it was on relationships and friendships and people you trusted, people you had working relations.
So it wasn't rural, urban.
It wasn't rural, urban. Yeah, it wasn't young, old, rural, urban, big spenders, little spenders. I didn't really think about the terms of social conservative at all in those times. But if I went back and analyzed my supporters then with today's definitions, they were all across the board on those.
Jump 2 years ahead, 90 election, Republicans come up with 63, and the Democrats come up with, Republicans come up with 62, and Democrats have the majority. You're elected minority leader. Did you have the same kind of close battle, or do you recall, how do you recall that second round?
It wasn't as close, and I don't recall exactly how it all played out. What I do remember is the morning after the election, I'd been asked quite a few weeks before to give a speech by a legislator who didn't vote for me to give it, but that's just a fact, to a nurses group in Wichita. So I'm here in the majority leader's office for election night. We've won the majority. I go to the Hyatt in Wichita, check in probably at 1 o'clock in the morning. Get up the next morning to give my speech, but I'd made an appointment to have breakfast with Todd Tiahrt, who was running against Rick Bowden in a rural Sedgwick County district, and he was somebody that I hadn't had a close working relationship with in his campaign. Quite frankly, didn't expect him to win, and I got a message at the hotel from Vicki saying the county clerk has called, or the election commissioners called and said that they miscounted the votes. Todd lost. Well, that was a big deal to the Tiaharts, but it was also a big deal to me because that meant we didn't have the majority; we had the minority.
Yeah. But as in terms of opposition, was it a rerun? I'm wondering if it was a rerun.
It was mixed. The people, some of the people that opposed me, or supported other people more than opposed me, were supporting me.
Who was?
And I don't remember quite how it ended up. Dale Sprague, who was was elected Speaker Pro Tem the same time I was Majority Leader, ran, and I can't remember if Mike O'Neill ran a campaign and then dropped out, if it was that race or the next race. But people were in and out.
So it actually was in a sense, a mix-up how do I say this? The 34 votes in 88 would not necessarily have been
The same 30. No. It was not a rerunning of the previous 2 years.
Well, let's jump ahead again.
Okay.
Just focusing on the leadership. After the 92 election, you're up to 66 Republicans, and you're running for Speaker.
The dynamics have changed a little bit, but because even though I managed to dodge the bullet and not take all the blame for losing the majority, I was able to capitalize on running some good campaigns, or helping run some good campaigns across the state to get the majority back and a sizable majority, and that picked me up some votes on the political side.
Did you do something for 92 election that you didn't do for 90?
We did more organized fundraising, that we could distribute the money out to candidates. We set up a campaign committee of elected. It was members of the Republican caucus, but they were elected by the Republican caucus to make those decisions on who was going to get the money, so that I couldn't be accused of of steering all the money to buying votes, in other words. And I was able to, that paid off, I think, in changing some votes.
I'm going to jump now
Okay.
to 94.
Okay.
Do you have any memory of 94?
Things, a lot of things had changed.
And the Republican numbers went from 66 to 80.
Yeah, a lot of things changed. Talk radio, Rush Limbaugh. The internet was just starting. We had a guy in Washington by the name of Newt Gingrich who was sending out cassette tapes to thousands of people across the country. I got them and was trying to figure out how to use those to re-record something I could listen to out on the tractor, or things like that. But there were people getting those that were got elected in the legislature. That was gospel, and I found out as I was going around, talking to these candidates, and I was getting questions, not what do I think about school finance or what kind of people would I appoint to the Judicial Committee, but what was my favorite Ayn Rand book? Questions I had not pondered for a long time, and this was important to them.
Yeah.
And I also I remember visiting with somebody that had beat an incumbent Democrat. The incumbent Democrat was Marvin Barkis. I can't think of the guy that beat him, but he ended up being majority leader. And I was talking to him about something about one of the important things we do, work on the budgets of the Regents institutions. He says, "What's a regent?" And I use that as an example. That there were more and more people getting elected that really didn't know what they'd been elected to. So it was just a whole different kind of campaign, and the social conservative issue, the one issue voters, guns, prayer in schools, homeschooling, all of that, and it all got wrapped.
Did you obviously said you kind of saw it coming.
Yes.
And of course, Newt Gingrich elected Speaker of
He was
the U.S. House
Yeah.
In that year. But my question is more, you were obviously involved in recruiting candidates, much like you've done 2 years earlier. Did you see, I mean, you mentioned the one legislator who won, beat Marvin. Did you see, were there signals out there?
I'm sure there were signals. I missed them. My approach when I was, I was not involved in candidate recruitment or any of that kind of stuff until I was elected majority leader. So, as majority leader, my approach was, if somebody wants to be a candidate and they appear to be a good candidate, and if they aren't a felon or a seriously accused wife beater or something like that, we'll work with them. We won't work with we're not going to take sides in the primary, but if they are the Republican candidate, we'll work with them, give them all the things that are available to all the other candidates. And I think that approach helped me get when I then ran and was elected Speaker the first time. I took that same approach the second time, and a bunch of people got elected that, if I'd have really been analyzing to see are they going to support me or not, I would have known they weren't going to support me. Go back to the Newt Gingrich thing. I think there was an influence that Gingrich was elected Speaker like a week and if I'm remembering right, like a week and a half before the leadership elections here in this room. And I think I think there were some people wanting to be like the big boys. If there can be that revolution in Washington, we want to be the guys that just came to Topeka and the revolution too. And I think that was an influence. Do I blame my defeat on that? My defeat was a lot of things, including my being aloof and distant. But it was a lot of things.
Well, so much for that.
Okay.
Let's move more to kind of policy. As you, and again, look back 30 years or so, and focusing on why you were in leadership, there are accomplishments of the legislature as a whole that you would point with pride to, or disappointments in that era? I mean, leadership is a consuming kind of activity.
You know, my style was to appoint people that I thought were really good leaders and had a lot of interest in the areas that I appointed them to serve in: appropriations, tax, all the various committees. And I pretty well leave the ball in their court. As a result of that, my memory isn't very good on what some of those accomplishments were. I'm very proud of the fact that during all my time in leadership, I never had a member of the caucus indicted. Those kinds of things, which we had good press. I was proud of the fact that I was never the victim of a political cartoon in my whole time in the legislature. And I don't think there's very many of the legislative leaders, even in my time, that could say that. But as far as specific things, I never championed a particular tax increase or a tax decrease. I never championed the building of a new building or a new department at a university. So I don't have those kinds of things to brag about, but I think not having those to brag about is something to brag about in a way.
When I think back of those years you were in leadership, obviously Mike Hayden's governor. Mike Hayden once advocates champions a highway program, building a prison, water plan funding, and a few things like that. A couple weeks ago, Marvin, in a sense, drew a contrast, says, I was for kids, not infrastructure. And I don't recall, well, I do recall you weren't greatly enthusiastic about a highway program.
That's right. I opposed it.
Did you finally vote for it, or did
No,
you didn't ever vote?
I never voted for it. And my thinking probably in hindsight was faulty, but I thought it was too much at one time, and it would leave itself open to misspent funds, mismanagement, and it all, to the best of my knowledge, worked out fine.
You were, again, according to the Burdett Loomis book, active in kids programs, even during the Hayden administration. How did that come about?
I'd gotten, number one, I had kids. All of a sudden, I'd adopted two young daughters. I had a different focus. I got involved with some other legislators with the same issues, and when I was minority leader, as you mentioned, Marvin was 4 kids. He created I think it was called the Kansas Commission on Children, something or another, and I was the vice chairman of that, and which was an unusual situation because usually the joint committees, there's the Senate, the vice chairman and the chairman and vice chairman are one's from the House and one's from the Senate. Marvin insisted that I be the vice chairman of that, and we made a number of recommendations which were enacted into policy.
Now, that's fairly audacious for the speaker and the minority leader to name themselves as chair and vice chair
Yes.
of the commission. Do you have any
I don't know.
hesitation about that?
I didn't have any hesitation. I don't know what kind of negotiations I wasn't involved in with the Senate leadership, but we got our way.
You got it done. Marvin talked about having a good relationship with you, certainly during his speaker's term. How did that happen? I mean, I look back and remember Marvin as being fairly a partisan guy, and of course I'm looking a little bit from the Hayden perspective, but here, and of course you had the rebels at that time making deals with Marvin on House rules. How did you and Marvin kind of become allies?
I was never sure that we were allies. This is a quote or a question that I really didn't anticipate. We haven't talked about the rebels, but when I was elected majority leader, Jim Braden was the speaker. One of the first things that the legislature does after they elect leadership is adopt rules, joint rules, temporary rules, permanent rules. And we got I believe it was the morning that we were going to be voting on the rules at like 10 o'clock, we got the word that a group of rebels these were Republican legislators, most of them not freshmen.
Kerry Patrick, David Miller, Bob Van Crum,
Yeah.
J.C. Long.
Yes, Dennis Spaniel, Vern, somebody from Wichita,
Williams.
old guys, young guys. We didn't know who all these were, and I think it was 12 and a half rebels. Clyde Graber, who's had a million different obituaries, and he's still alive, but he's had a million different obituaries written. The latest one dealing with the pig farms up there that he resigned from the county commission on. But we got the word that this was going to happen.
And we're talking about 88?
This would have been 88.
88
Yeah.
session.
So, the first thing I did was go into, as a newly elected, I went in and talked to the speaker.
What's going on?
Yeah, and I misspoke. I said, Jim, no, I just now misspoke. I didn't go in to talk to the speaker. I went in to talk to the minority leader, Marvin Barkas,
Okay.
and said, and he said yes, and I said, can we have some time to kind of negotiate? I said, there's some of these things that I'm hearing that you guys want. I like not having really late night sessions at the end of the session. Having tighter rules on what can be money added into an appropriation bill that's for like an airplane for the executive branch of government that never been talked publicly about anything. And he said, no, we've got the votes. We're going to do it. So from that point on, I never really felt like we were 100% on the same page. On issues like the children's issues, I had no doubt.
How did you balance this in the 88 and 89 sessions, or excuse me, 89 and 90 sessions? Mike Hayden is governor. A lot of things on the agenda that were gubernatorial initiatives. Your kind of leadership role in, to some degree, supporting the governor, certainly, and your hesitation with some of the issues like the highway.
The highway program was the only one where I remember. A lot of the things Mike Governor Hayden and I were coming from the same place.
Yeah. Well, let's jump to the 92 session. some issues. I mean, the school finance issue was a big issue, and you had not been in the education committee or the tax committee. How did you, I mean, and Finney, in a sense, started, I mean, a district court judge started the issue rolling, and Finney grabbed it, and then the House Democrats. How did you see that initiative from the House Democrats, the majority, one vote majority in the House? How did you view that at the time? Was that, you view it as partisan or not, or?
The Democrat, I don't have a completely clear recollection of those moments.
Yeah.
But you know, the House Democrats have viewed themselves, among other things, as, you know, the pro-education party, and as time moved on, you know, the Republicans, they weren't anti-education, but they were, in a lot of the Republicans, not the party, but a lot of the Republicans were anti-teacher, and it was hard to separate out, you know, is school finance money for teachers or is it money for education? And then it gets partisan when you kind of get
into.
into.
Minority leader at the time, how did your caucus come down? Is pretty much like you just described.
Pretty much like I just said, yeah.
Antagonism toward the teachers union, probably a number of them weren't supported.
Right, and the teachers had never supported them. Why should we support the teachers?
But, the initiative of the House Democrats got a lot of Republican support.
Yeah.
Did the caucus have a position, as he said?
I can't recall.
Yeah. Well, I was curious because that was certainly a significant development of that 92 session.
I might throw something in here, kind of blend a couple of things we've talked about in.
Yeah.
I mentioned the position of Republican legislators on education versus their position on teachers. I'd considered myself pro-education and pro-teacher and able to work with the teachers' organizations. When the committee that we talked about, that Marvin was the chairman of the commission and I was vice chairman, on children, we did hearings, and I did hearings of my own in my district, and I tried to get teachers involved, because who better besides parents to talk about how do you solve, you know, some of the problems, how do you identify the problems, then how do you solve the problems. And I was literally shocked, and you know, it takes a lot to shock me, or it did in those days, when they showed up with their union rep, who didn't live in the district, didn't know the kids we were talking about, and quickly pivoted the conversation to money. You know, and on teachers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, if you pay the teachers more, all these problems will go away. That's probably not quite a fair assessment, but the fact that, you know, they brought the KNEA rep out of Wichita, out of Hayesville, or wherever the particular person was from. They wouldn't, you know, and I got the feeling they had been given some kind of instructions not to show up at my stuff without their guy, and that soured me. Not enough to be vindictive, but it soured me on some of that.
You and Marvin were obviously working together on the children's initiatives. Right. How do you remember that? I mean, as you look back, and Joan Wagner was
Joan Wagner and Kathleen Zaburis. Joan Wagner and Kathleen Zaburis were one that we co-sponsored several pieces of legislation prior to Marvin coming up with the idea of having the commission.
Was that, did you see that simply as a continuation of stuff you worked
Yes,
on earlier?
yes. Just a massive broadening of looking into those issues.
Is there anything in that that you can point to that you were particularly interested in, or?
Pretty much all of it. Again, my memory, I can't remember. And then, Mike Hayden also had and my memory of some of those, my wife was on his, on his, I don't remember what it was called, a task force or a commission. And some of the issues in my memory are kind of commingled.
And having kids kind of sparked
Yes.
this. Did you get any criticism for your work there?
From members of the caucus?
Yeah.
Not a lot. I mean, there were some of them. You mentioned some of the names, Kerry Patrick and David Miller, that are going to criticize you. Even if it's their idea that you go down and talk on, then they'd come down and talk against it.
You were involved in in leadership over, 6 legislative sessions. As you look back, what stands out? We really did a good job this session.
Maybe not.
We really screwed up. Didn't.
Probably passing the death penalty is the one moment when I sat there and hit the gavel and knew that
In other words, getting that done.
getting that done
And that would have been 93 or 4.
and Governor Finney was going to let it become law,
Yeah.
even though she opposed it.
Talk about that a little bit. How did that come to your mind?
That's a life, even though nobody's been executed. When I hit that gavel, I didn't know that nobody was going to be executed. But that's a pretty weighty decision.
Had that, I mean, that had been bouncing around for
It had been bouncing around pretty much every
15 years.
Yeah, pretty much since I'd been in the legislature, when the Supreme Court had.
Were you on the voting for it?
Yes.
So,
I mean, it wasn't something I campaigned on. It wasn't but I was always a supporter.
you, during your leadership, obviously had Mike Hayden in the governor's chair for 2 sessions and Finney for 4 sessions. As you look back, how do you remember those relationships?
It was day and night difference. I mean, Mike Hayden, when he came to the legislature, I believe 2 years after I did. So we were roughly the same age. He was at Kansas State when I was there. I didn't know him at the time, although when I go back to the yearbook, I see that we were in the same place in the same, at the same time. But anyway. So and then we referred to Wendell Lady when he was speaker and was running for speaker as his kind of a kitchen cabinet, a group of us that would get together after lobbyist functions or whatever late at night and make plans and talk about what we'd do if we were the big boys. And so I'd been around Mike for several years. So that, and then when he became speaker, he didn't use that kind of team, or if he did, he didn't tell me about it. But I suspect he really didn't have that kind of group. But when he was governor, it was a lot more open. There was no relationship with Governor Finney. I had a guy that was my best man in my wedding, a high school classmate of mine, and this wasn't really, really well known up here in this building, for obvious reasons, was Jack Steineger's administrative assistant, Richard Larimore. And Richard was a good friend of Joan Finney. And Richard said, you got to treat her like you would your aunt or something. So when she got elected, and she had the leadership out for a breakfast out at Cedar Crest. So I took her a housewarming present. I went around my district and gathered up cornmeal from the Oxford mill and honey from a local beekeeper, and that made up a nice little basket. I don't know if she ever saw it after I handed it to her at the door. I mean, and I tried 2 or 3 other things like that to kind of establish a relationship, and just never happened. I was not around her office very much at all, dealing with her. Her staff, yes, but not her.
Marvin described coming out of her office with you, and you're both shaking your head.
I'm sure that's accurate. I'm sure that's accurate.
No correction?
No correction on that.
Well, there was obviously a significant break in the 91 session between Marvin and the governor. The way Marvin described it is we worked hard to pass legislation, and then she vetoed it without consultation, and then he said we were gleeful to override her veto. I mean, here's the Democrats have the majority, and they won't even support the governor's vetoes. Just kind of, not that you were in the middle of that, how did you observe that at the time?
Quite frankly, I don't remember what the issue was. And maybe this is not being around discussions for the last 20 years or something. I don't remember what that issue even was.
Yeah.
But I know things like that happen.
I mean, she was overridden
multiple times.
Multiple times, and
some of them were insignificant kinds of pieces of legislation.
Yeah. In Marvin's view, the overrides were on things that his House Democrat majority had worked on.
Right.
And I was kind of curious as you were watching the Democrats override how that was going. You want to take a break?
No, I just thought I had my alarm clock going off.
You've talked about this a little bit. I'm shifting again. And I was trying to think how to raise it. In fact, I've written in a book on Kansas politics that the 94 session, or 94 election, was a real break in state politics, national politics. And I guess in part, I've asked this question, but I'm in a sense framing it in a broader sense. Did you see this coming? You mentioned the Gingrich tapes, and I mean, if I were looking from 94 earlier, politics were pretty competitive in Kansas between Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats had actually won a House majority twice in that
period,
prior 20 years. Other than the Gingrich tapes, so to speak, did you see this kind of shift?
I saw numerous things. I didn't connect the dots in a meaningful way, that it was anything but, a passing fad or something, calling anything that, the Republicans, calling anything they didn't like a liberal plot, big spenders, socialist, things that were just, not right. I didn't think it would ever stick, but it just all came together, and that's part of what the Gingrich tapes were saying. Have a plan, label your opponent, you make the issues. It doesn't have to be necessarily the whole truth. It doesn't have to be the most important issue. Is homeschooling. In that day, it was homeschooling. The most important issue in the state was, at what level should gun laws be made? Should they be made at the state level or at the local level? Is that one of the most important issues? But people were campaigning on those issues.
Did you connect the rebels with this later development in '94, in the '94 election, Gingrich and whatever?
I didn't really. A lot of those people, if you look at where they went, they were kind of all over the place later on. Some of them didn't run for re-election. They didn't follow through. I expected to see even as far into the future as Brownback's being elected. I expected to see some of those people surface in appointments. It didn't. I'm not sure how much of that was just a group of people that were backbenchers, and they all came together at one point in time. And I don't mean this as I probably shouldn't say it. I don't mean it as derogatory as it sounds, but the old saying, if you put 100 monkeys at 100 typewriters, eventually there's going to be a good novel written. That might be a little bit what happened, but these were intelligent guys. Yeah. But they didn't have. I don't think they had a lot in common with kind of the where the party has gone now.
Yeah. I was trying to think of those that stuck around. David Miller, of course, stuck around in politics in the '90s. Schallenberger wasn't in that group.
Schallenberger was in that. He was in that group. Yes.
Okay.
J.C. didn't stick around that long. Dennis Spaniel didn't stick around. The older guys from Western Kansas didn't stick around. Clyde Graber stuck around and ended up being in the Graves administration. Well, Graves appointed him instead of Schallenberger. I don't know if I'd ever thought of that before. He appointed him state treasurer instead of Schallenberger.
Huh. I'd forgotten that too. Did you see one thing I'm trying to understand is when Koch Industries, Charles Koch, entered into state politics, Jonathan Small apparently was representing Koch Industries in the 80s. I don't remember that at all. And of course, later the Kochs got involved with ALEC and creating Kansas Policy Institute and a variety of other vehicles. Did you see that at all?
I don't know at what point I became aware of the Kochs as we know them now. I remember when I was at Kansas State, Fred Koch his name being out there and him being around it was Southwest Greece, if I remember right at the time, but the John Birch Society Board of Directors and things like that. And then kind of from my perspective, the Koch name disappeared. When I got elected to the legislature, Willard Garvey was the guy that was funding think tanks and had people around, was making campaign contributions where he would give you warehouse receipts for bushels of wheat instead of money, and then somewhere that transition took place, and I don't know exactly when that happened, but in looking back, I think the Koch's rise in all this stuff was pretty quick.
And pretty much after your leadership.
Yes, when Alex when I was speaker, Alex was Kansas was kind of getting some certain people from Kansas were getting involved in Alex, but I don't remember the Koch involvement at that point in time.
Do you recall members of the Republican caucus attending ALEC
Yes.
meetings?
Yes.
So,
And in fact, one of the things I was trying to do was cut back on duplicate or sort of duplicate organizations, and at the time there were two. From the time I was elected to the legislature until the time I was speaker, there had been mergers of a number of government. I don't know what the right word is. The National Conference of State Legislatures was a merger of several previous organizations, and there was another organization, Council of State Governments, and I was working to try to eliminate even more of that duplication, and I was surprised when all of a sudden there was resistance in the caucus. They wanted to add another body, this brand new body, and start sending. Which was ALEC, and start sending people to that. And when I kind of played the fiscal responsibility card, they said, "Oh, we'll just use their money. We don't, and that's, I don't know if there's state money goes into it now, other than maybe per diem or something."
Another development, obviously, during this period was the abortion issue.
Yes.
Right to life, Summer of Mercy. How do you remember the emergence of that?
Well, it was a federal and state affairs issue. It was only, I think, when I was speaker, I started sending some of the issues to judiciary because it evolved into much more appropriately where legal minds needed to be involved, not the mismatch of federal and state affairs. Most of the issues in the early days in federal state affairs, they usually didn't go very far because the Catholics and the evangelicals weren't on the same page, and they'd be fighting each other and the pro-life or pro-choice people. So the pro-choice people usually came out ahead because the other side was divided.
Were you aligned in any way? Those issues.
I always supported the pro-choice.
Yeah. I skipped over something I wanted to ask you about, and I'm back during your leadership years. The Loomis book described you as a policy entrepreneur on campaign finance reform. Is that an accurate description?
It's an interesting description. I thought I'd read all his stuff, and I don't remember that one. A little bit of background, campaign finance and issues like that. When I ran for the legislature, weren't on on anybody's radar screen in Sumner County, Kansas, let alone Kansas. Then came along Watergate, and all of a sudden that was a big issue. And Richard Walker, who was just retired as a district judge now in Harvey County, but came to the legislature 2 years after I did, kind of took that issue on as a cause, and were really involved in that issue, creating what was then known, it's got a different name now, I think, but the Governmental Ethics Commission, and passing on, and Speaker McGill, I think had some regrets later on about how some of the things played out, but was very helpful in those issues.
Now, Loomis is talking about the '89 session. Do you recall? And let's forget that. What did you see needed to be done in campaign finance reform? I mean, did you have a strong feeling about changing something at that time?
Well, what I was talking about was earlier than that. I'm not sure.
So
I'm not sure what
okay. So your most of your memory goes
back
to
in
the McGill
back
Speaker era.
back in 73, 74, that time frame.
Well, I'll tell Burdette that he's off base.
When they're he might
One other thing, I'm jumping around a little bit, but the Kochs were having a big legal battle, Charles and David versus Bill. And Bill Koch got connected with Governor Finney to some extent. Do you recall anything about that activity? Not that it would have been a legislative issue.
I'm trying to think. I know he got involved with the Attorney General, Carla Stovall, but and he is the only one that I've met with on a one-on basis. I had actually, he initiated.
What do you recall about that?
It was very interesting, but for somebody with as many degrees as he has, I almost had to order breakfast for him. I guess is probably the way to put it in layman's language.
Well,
and it was obvious that he was just he was wanting to get as many supporters on his side of something that we weren't even players in. But he was trying to create all that goodwill and funding the crime commission and all those things.
You don't remember a similar meeting with Charles Koch?
No.
Well, I think we've covered a good part of what some of the legislative stuff. 26 years, you got to see a lot of folks. You had not only be in leadership, but see a lot of folks in leadership. And I just looking at, a number of governors, speakers, minority leaders, Senate presidents, et cetera. Who stands out in that 26-year period that they really had figured this out and helped the state move forward? Anybody in particular?
I think kind of on an equal level. Mike Hayden and John Carlin both had some good visions and good skills at executing. Mike Hayden got caught up in the whole property tax issue, which wasn't all to his making, whether it was handled completely right. But Governor Finney was able to really capitalize on that.
Did you have much experience with Robert F. Bennett?
Not a lot. I was new enough to the legislature, and he had a certain group of guys that he hung out with, and I didn't have a lot in common with that group of guys. And they weren't bad guys for the most part.
Yeah. What about, I mean, obviously, Mike Hayden, John Carlin, legislative leaders. Any others that stand out?
Wendell Lady is, kind of one of my favorites.
Did you, during your leadership, did you kind of draw on some of your experience with those folks?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to, when I was making decisions and on how to, how to refer bills or who to appoint to some committee, and more importantly, maybe how to explain that to what I'd done to the caucus. I tried to think, refer back to how those guys did it, and sometimes I was successful in drawing some comparisons and using their tactics, and sometimes I wasn't.
I came on to go on the internet and put Robert H. Miller in there. I come on an article that lists a whole series of awards that you received while you were in the legislature. And according to this article, a Legislator of the Year award was granted, and I can't remember the year. I'm not even sure it's indicated. What was that about?
There was a publication out of Wichita called Kansas Magazine. It wasn't the Kansas Magazine that the economic development had, and it was run. I'm trying to think of the person. This is infamous. He built churches out in. His wife, who later on married Jim Baker.
Yeah.
But so it was Jim Baker's. Anyway, she had the magazine.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I'll be darned.
And they were trying to. And they did a pretty nice. They picked me, but they did a nice job of copying Texas Monthly. Texas Monthly for years has done a series on outstanding legislators and legislative furniture, and that's this magazine did it one time, and I happened to.
You remember what year it was?
It was the year before I ran for majority leader, because I know I mailed a copy of that to everybody.
Very good. Well, I'm through all my questions. Anything else you want to put in the memory bank of the
26 years, you do meet a lot of very interesting people, from all walks of life, from all over the state. Probably my biggest regret, and this probably goes back to the reoccurring theme of being aloof and distant, is I didn't develop very close relationships, or close enough relationships with some of those people that have continued on for the for 20 years out, because it's just a great group of people. And I always pictured myself as kind of one of the guys in the Continental Congress that would go take care of business and then go back to their plow that was leaned up against the tree, hook it up to the horse, and go back to work. And I never had aspirations to run for governor or to run for another office. Which if you don't have those kind of aspirations, it does give you a little more flexibility. It also takes away probably some of your drive and motivation to really go for the kill.
I've got a policy question I'm going to save. I got some notes, but you lost a speaker's job.
Yes.
After the '94 election.
Right.
You decided not to run again. And Marvin reminded me he ran for Attorney General even after
Right.
he'd lost. I don't recall that you ever ran for elective office again.
No, and I never had any plan to run for another.
How
Another
did you
office.
see that? Did you say, I've done my time?
No, it was time. It was time to go back, pick up, that plow that was, and kind of interesting. That point in life, or that point in life, cotton was becoming a new crop. And my first year out of the legislature, I planted my first cotton crop, and all of a sudden I was involved in national because of my political background. The cotton producing states saw that they could add another representative from a state that gave them access to 2 more senators and 5 at that time 5 congressmen, and I rose to positions in some national cotton organizations that I didn't have any business rising to, but that made a second fun run in my life.
So, cotton politics, is there politics in the cotton?
There's a lot of politics, and every once in a while when there's debate on the farm bill, people always say, the dairy guys and the cotton guys always get their way because they know how to do it. And Barry Flinchbaugh used to tell that story. Said if the wheat guys could just get their act together like the cotton guys and the dairy guys. Now that I'm a cotton guy, I see exactly what they're talking about.
Raymond Powers, I think, has reminded me that an issue, and this is, I would think, prior to leadership, that was significant over a number of years, Wolf Creek. And you may have had a number of involvements in that. How do you remember that issue? Were you involved in that?
Very, very. Raymond would remember that because he was the legislative research staff for the committee that I chaired on energy and
He didn't want us to miss that.
energy and natural resources. I thought it was bad economics. I thought the rural electric co-ops were kind of sucked into being a part of Wolf Creek because they wanted to run with the big boys. I mentioned on regards to the teachers about the I thought they didn't want to go to meetings without their union guy or their teachers organization guy. I sent a letter out. We had a special committee on Wolf Creek. I can't remember exactly what the subject matter was, but that was in a nutshell. I sent a letter out to every local rural electric co-op board member, asking them some pretty simple questions. I got 3 answers back before the Kansas, whatever the state organization, put the word out. Nobody talked to Miller. To me, that was very, very telling. I went to a couple of, the wool was being pulled over all the local people's, they talk about being co-ops being, run from the grassroots, but they weren't being on that. And I think, many of those people a few years later, wish that, their local co-op had not joined the consortium that was part of Wolf Creek.
Do you remember the time frame you're talking about? Because I remember it goes back to the Bennett.
This would have been, I have to count on my fingers, 78 to 82. And I'm not sure exactly where, but those were the 4 years I was chairman of that committee. And I'm not sure.
That's the Energy Committee.
That was the Energy Committee. And I'm not sure where in that 4 years that fell.
Yeah. Bennett, obviously, before that time. But
Yeah.
there was it John Simpson of Salina?
Right.
Senator Simpson that was a big opponent
Yes.
of that.
And Arnold Berman from Lawrence.
Okay. And so you were a strong opponent
Yes.
of that. Was it just on economics?
My argument was economics, not the safety. I got involved in low level radioactive waste disposal and was on the group that negotiated a compact between like 5 states to dispose of the waste, which never came to fruition. None of the compacts that were passed in the United States ever built a site. Yeah.
The low-level nuclear waste fund.
Yeah, but the safety part didn't concern me. It was the economics, which I think, in hindsight, is still the problem, and that's why there's like
Has your view changed on that?
no. I mean, there are several plants that utilities have spent literally billions of dollars on that are never going to be built, and the ratepayers are.
And basically, you would conclude consumers are just paying a lot more than they would have had
Yep.
to pay
That's right.
as a result of this. Okay. Well, unless Raymond has more. I think we're going to bring it to a close.
Okay.
Thank you for putting up with all the questions and digging back in the gray matter.
I've thought of things I hadn't thought about for a long time.
Any closing statement? You had an earlier closing statement.
Nothing else.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob.